Welcome to today's webinar, how education organizations can tap into billions of dollars into broadband funding. I'm your host today. I'm Jim Jorsted. I'm the Senior Fellow with the Center for Digital Education, and I'm excited to serve as your moderator for today's webcast. Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a great session over the next 60 minutes. Now, before we begin, a couple of brief housekeeping notes. A recording of this presentation will be emailed to all the registrants within 48 hours. You can use the recording for your reference or feel free to pass it on to your colleagues. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and you can participate in Q&As with us by asking questions at any time during the presentation. Now, please send in your questions as they come up throughout today's presentation. And our speakers will address as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A portion at the close of our webinar today. Now, also during today's webinar, you'll be able to connect with all your peers via LinkedIn, Twitter, as well as Facebook. Please use the hashtag GovTechLive to connect with your peers across the Government Technology and Center for Digital Education platform via Twitter. Now, at this time, we recommend you disable your pop-up blockers, and if you are experiencing any media player issues, please submit a question into the Q&A, and we'll help address them as they come up. Now, today, we have a special panel with us. Today, who will be joining us will be Sarah Blue. She's a broadband program specialist at NTIA. We have Jen Laser. She's the president of The Quilt. And we have Scott Pullman. He's the director of business development, higher education practice at Lumen. We're very excited to have these folks participate in our session today and get their insights on this very timely topic. Now, before we begin today, what I'd like to do is set the table for us. When we look at broadband, what does it mean? This is the FCC definition. It says broadband is a high-speed internet allowing access to the internet at a higher speed than dial-up internet services. So we've come a long way. Now, when we look at broadband, there's different categories that I'm sure many in the audience are aware of today. We have DSL. That's the faster transmission at the time through copper wires, remember that. Cable modems, we're quite aware of those by using coaxial cables. Fiber optics, we're quite aware of those as well, and basically we're sending signals through light waves through fiber. And then wireless, many of us are on today, wireless for home or as well for business. And then satellite. So these are the main categories when we try to define what really broadband is. Now, what is our goal here? Well, when we look at broadband, it provides access to high-quality internet. And so these are some of the things that we've experienced. For example, web conferencing, Zoom, Teams, other things. We're on 24 today. Medical services. We are just still getting through the pandemic, and we all know the importance of web conferencing and medical technology through this very difficult period. We use broadband for interactive applications, certainly multimedia resources, but really our goals are to provide these lower costs. We want to increase this labor productivity and availability. And I'll point out, more importantly, during the pandemic, what did we do? We all worked remotely, and broadband was an important aspect to us to be successful. And then very importantly, we want to reach those underserved rural areas, and that's a long time goal. Now, there's a little bit of recent history when we look at how we spent money on broadband infrastructure. If we go back to 2009, there was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, and there was $7.2 billion allocated for broadband projects, wireless as well as land-based. And then the following year, the FCC presented the National Broadband Plan, and this really was to outline some goals for our national investment and our overall broadband infrastructure plan. So this is what's kind of setting the stage to where we are today. And a great opportunity this last summer, August 10th, 2021, the House and Senate passed the $1.2 trillion investment for infrastructure to be spent over the next 8 years. Now, when you look at this, it encompasses quite a bit in this infrastructure bill. You'll see we have roads, electrical grids, passenger, water control, climate, communications, transportation, electric vehicles, and what we're going to focus on today is that $65 billion portion of that infrastructure bill that was passed. So it's an exciting time. Now, I like to use this example because when we use millions, billions, and trillions of dollars, it's hard to get a sense of what that truly means. So if I had the opportunity to have $1 billion here with me today, and I'd pick someone in the audience today, I would like you to spend $1,000 per day. And when you think about it, how long would it take you to spend that? And when you think about it, if you have some math whizzes out there, you might be calculating right now, but to not delay the answer, it's 2,740 years. So that's over 27 centuries to spend $1,000 a day if you had $1 billion in your pocket. So that's a huge investment. Well, let's take it a step further. We talk trillions of dollars. So as I said earlier, we have a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill out there. Let's put it in some other form. Let's say I have $1 trillion I'm going to give you today, and I want you to stack $1 bills on top of each other. How far would that actually reach? And when you think about it, it's almost unbelievable. It's over almost 68,000 miles. And when you put that in perspective, that's about a quarter of the way to the moon. So a huge amount of investment. So when we're talking about billions and trillions, it's good to have that sense of what's that order of magnitude. So what is our goals here? Well, we want to lower our cost of internet per household and improve our overall infrastructure of the internet. Now, I've indented an important part, and that is we want to make sure we are taking care of the underserved areas throughout the country. And that's an important goal as we talk about today's topic. And this entire process is going to be overseen by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or short for NTIA. So that's the core of what we're going to be talking about today. And what better person to talk about that is Sarah Blue. Again, she's our broadband program specialist for NTIA. Straight from the horse's mouth. Sarah, take it from here.
Thank you, Jim. It is a really exciting time right now, coming straight from the administration, who is extremely focused on making sure that every American has access to affordable and high quality broadband access. So today, what I'm going to talk about within the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, we have the Middle Mile program. And like Jim said, $1 billion, which I was kind of daydreaming what I would do with $1,000 a day. So that was very helpful. Thank you. But I'm going to talk about the Middle Mile program today. We're going to go over an overview of the program, talk about eligible uses and entities, commitments and requirements of the grantee. We'll talk about prioritization of awards and other relevant requirements. What I'd like to point out here, I am not a fan of reading from slides. However, we are in a position right now where we're drafting the notice of funding opportunity, which will be out in a few months. We just closed on our request for comments window. That was at the end. It was a couple weeks, last week maybe. We had over 577 comments. That was for all of the programs, Middle Mile, BEAD, Tribal, and the digital equity. We're sorting through all those right now. Those comments are all public. All of that to say, we're taking those comments into account as we draft the notice of funding. So I do have to stick to the slides. What we're trying to do here is, the legislature is very complex, and it's hard to follow, to be honest with you. So we're trying to organize the content in a way that makes it a little bit simpler, I hope. As you think about, in a few months, we will release the notice of funding for the Middle Mile program. And so if you can begin thinking now about what eligible uses are, what you're, as an entity, are you eligible to apply, and all of that, that's my hope. That's my objective as we talk today. So to kick things off, this is the Middle Mile. It's officially the Enabling Middle Mile Broadband Infrastructure Program. We have $1 billion, like we've talked about. This is a competitive grant program. And Jim, that was also very helpful for you to point out the different types of technology. This program is tech neutral, and I want to make sure that everybody understands that. And the objective of the program is to encourage the extension of middle mile infrastructure in order to reduce the cost of unserved as well as underserved areas, and also to promote broadband resiliency. Here, we're going to talk about some of the eligible uses. What the legislature allows us to do is grant these funds for the construction, improvement, or acquisition of middle mile infrastructure. Middle mile is defined as broadband infrastructure that does not connect directly to an end user location, including an anchor institution. Additionally, there's a lot that you can do with this. You can buy dark fiber, you can lease dark fiber, do an IRU, it's backhaul, it's connections between data centers, it's submarine cables. There's a lot of different definitions of what middle mile looks like. And again, it's we're tech neutral, so it can be wired and it can be wireless. We're looking at the realm of possibilities. The eligible entities, I think, is where it gets really fun, because in the BEAD program, that just under $42.5 billion, that money will be given to the states and to the territories. The tribal program it's similar to what we did with the tribal program from last year that we're underway with right now. What you can do as an eligible entity for the middle mile program, you might be a state or political subdivision, which is what we asked for with the broadband infrastructure program. But you can also be a tech company, you can be a utility company, you can be a co-op, you can be a native entity or an economic developmental authority. There are a lot of options in who may apply for these funds. All right. There's priorities, build time, and there's accountability, and each of these pillars is very important. Regarding the priorities, in order to be eligible, an eligible entity must connect middle mile infrastructure to last mile networks who provide or plan to provide broadband service to households in unserved areas. We'll also prioritize connecting non-contiguous trust lands or the offering of wholesale broadband services at reasonable rates on a carrier-neutral basis. Those themes you will see throughout this presentation, so I'll come back to that. As far as the build time, there's an understanding that, we're hearing from small ISPs all the way up to the largest. We all know that supply chain is an issue. There's labor issues, there's shortages on fiber and conduit, maybe, all kinds of materials. You will have 5 years to complete this middle mile program. And of course, if there are extenuating circumstances, we would be able to possibly grant an extension for that. The accountability is also very important. What the Assistant Secretary will do here is, in order to establish sufficient transparency and accountability, reporting and oversight measures for the program to deter the waste, fraud, and abuse of programs, we will establish build-out requirements for each entity. And we will ask for a certain percentage of project miles to be completed by a certain date. Additionally, there will be penalties or pulling back funds for grantees who do not meet the build-out requirements as described. It's also important, this little note on the bottom is like the tiny little warning, but it's not so dangerous. But I just want to make sure that everybody understands that the amount of the grant awarded may not exceed 70% of the total project cost. I think read in a different way, you might say that we're looking for 30% match. That's Sarah Blue's way of saying that. So I would stick to what the slide says for right now. There are requirements for the proposed projects. One is that the project must be capable of supporting retail broadband service. The other is interconnection and non-discrimination. This we saw on the last slide. We are looking for middle mile grants projects that will use fiber. And I have to call out here, it says fiber optic technology, we are tech agnostic, but in this interconnect, what we're thinking of is because you physically interconnect fibers as opposed to something like wireless. So that's this comment here, that those interconnections must be offered to the to connect to the public internet and allow the physical interconnection for the exchange of traffic, and that the entity who's applying for the funds shall disclose their proposed interconnection, non-discrimination, as well as network management practices when they submit their application to NTIA. And then this is another important one to talk about, and that's connecting anchor institutions. Again, you'll see fiber optic technology here, and that's just because the way physically the way that fiber works, but don't read anything into that. The applicant should ensure that middle mile broadband network will be capable of providing broadband to anchor institutions at not less than 1 gigabit per second download and 1 gig up to the anchor institution. Additionally, we're asking that the applicant, the legislation states that the applicant must include direct interconnect facilities to facilitate broadband service to anchor institutions within 1,000 feet of the middle mile infrastructure. Mapping is really near and dear to my heart. Here at NTIA, we have the National Broadband Availability Map, and we've got, there's also the FCC Form 477 information. There's, of course, the new fabric data that the FCC is compiling right now. I came from the private sector. I've only been with NTIA for 1 year now. And so maps and KMZs were my life. When I had an office, I had them plastered all around the walls. I love seeing where these networks are. And that's what I love about the Middle Mile program, is that there's so much network that's out there, with the administration so committed to delivering high quality, reliable broadband service to all Americans. How do we tap into that existing infrastructure? So thinking about all of that, the legislation goes on to say that the eligible entity will use the most recent data that comes from the FCC fixed broadband map or from state and tribal governments with jurisdiction, and also speed and usage surveys from existing broadband service that meet certain criteria. We will also ask that this kind of information be provided in a uniform format to be determined by the Assistant Secretary. And the reasons that we're going to be asking for the maps at the as-built, as-designed, whatever it is that we settle upon, that information will be used solely for the purpose of carrying out the program and any related reporting. It will not be made public. This will be for the purposes of the program. So there we go. This slide kind of makes me giggle a little bit, and this is where I think we're really trying to organize the content in a way to prompt you to think about your application. But it is confusing. I feel like everything's a priority. So in that spirit, on the left here, we are being told by the legislation that the Assistant Secretary should give priority to projects that leverage existing rights-of-way, assets, and infrastructure in order to minimize financial, regulatory, permitting challenges. I would say on that, we're hearing loud and clear in our listening sessions and seeing the RFC comments that we know that permitting, I know from building networks, that it takes a long time. So if your middle mile project can leverage anything that's already built, this right here is where the Assistant Secretary should give priority. Additionally, the projects which enable connecting unserved anchor institutions, including tribal anchor institutions, will be given priority. Prioritization will also be given to projects that facilitate the development of carrier-neutral interconnection facilities, like we talked about a few slides ago. Carrier-neutral interconnection is a focus of this legislation. And here, this last point, that projects will be prioritized, which it's not an either, it's an and, improve the redundancy and resiliency of existing middle mile infrastructure and reduce the regulatory and permitting barriers to promote the construction of new middle mile infrastructure. I'll let you chew on that a little bit. And then I'll go on to say the Assistant Secretary shall give priority to applications meeting at least 2 of these 5 conditions. Those are, 1, those who adopt a fiscally sustainable middle mile strategy, which seems like it makes a lot of sense. Here you see the non-discriminatory interconnect policies connecting to terrestrial wireless last mile broadband providers and anybody who's making a legitimate request. The third condition is identifying those providers who have expressed interest in interconnecting and demonstrated sustainable business plans or funding with respect to that interconnect. There will be the fourth condition here is those who have supplemental investments or in-kind support to accelerate completion of the project. And then finally, those projects which will benefit the U.S. national security interests. The tribal program will continue. There's an additional $2 billion that's being given to the tribal program. But additionally here, we recognize that the Assistant Secretary may waive certain requirements or specify alternatives if the Assistant Secretary finds the alternative requirement necessary for the delivery and administration of middle mile grants to tribal governments or to the construction, improvement, and acquisition of middle mile infrastructure on trust land. So thank you for giving me a few minutes to talk about that, and I'll hand it back over to Jim.
That sounds good. And you also have a slide for some additional questions you can email at this area. So thank you. I think it's a good time. Thank you. You did a great job, Sarah. Let's go on to a polling question to get some interactivity from the audience. So on your screen, it should say, is your organization planning on applying for grants from the Middle Mile Infrastructure Program? And if you'd like in the audience to start clicking yes, no, or not sure yet. And I'll leave that slide up just for a couple seconds and see if people can chime in. So we're starting to get some people chime in now, so thank you. This is your first test question. And there are no wrong answers. Give that another about 10 seconds to let people chime in. Okay, let's see what our results look like. So about let's shy of 20% say yes, 10% no, and we got a large percentage that not sure. So hopefully the discussion today will help those individuals and institutions decide where to take their next steps. So let's move on to the next presenter, Jen Leisure. She's the president of the Quilt. So Jen, take us in a discussion about how the Quilt can help out.
Sure, thank you. Thanks everyone. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you today. I am going to spend some time talking with you about the Quilt and research and education networks. We'll be talking about some of the past participation of research and education networks in federal funding programs. Specifically, we'll be talking about R&E networks, short for research and education networks, as middle mile infrastructure partners. And then I'll briefly touch on some of the comments that were submitted jointly between the Quilt and Internet2 in response to the NTIA's request for comments that Sarah just spoke about that were turned in a couple of weeks ago. So first, just some background about the Quilt. The Quilt is a nonprofit 501c3 organization established over 20 years ago. By the way, our member organizations are now up to 38. We're so happy that recently the Idaho Regional Optical Network, or IRON, has joined the Quilt. All of our member organizations are also nonprofit entities that are either university-based organizations, independent nonprofit corporations, or a division of state government. Collectively, these networks connect a large number of higher education institutions, which continues to grow year over year, as well as tens of thousands of other community anchor institutions. And when I talk about community anchor institutions, I'll give you a flavor of exactly who that is here on our next slide. So the roots of the research and education networks are in higher education. They were established by universities to meet the needs of the most demanding users, academic researchers. And since the decades since research and education networks were developed or created, these networks have grown to connect these different types of anchor institutions that you see here, K through 12 schools, public libraries, public healthcare, and other entities. No two research and education networks are alike. Some are statewide, some are regional in the geographies that they serve. Each reflect their own landscape of stakeholders and partners and community anchor institutions. So here is a map, which is a little difficult to see, I know, but hopefully if you want to dive in, you can find it in the slides after our presentation today. If you were able to zoom in, what you're looking at here are the colored lines. These are the intrastate network lines that capture the backbones for each of these networks that are member organizations of the Quilt. And then what you don't see here are the thousands of last mile connections into the direct member institutions, which very often are partnered with with additional commercial telecom partners to reach those last mile locations. But you get a sense here from you get a sense for the expansiveness of this network infrastructure. Each of these networks are also connected into Internet 2, which is our national research and education network backbone. All right. So next, I'd like to spend a little time talking about the programs that R&E networks, national federal funding programs that R&E networks have participated in historically. You saw mention in Sarah's slides about the ARRA. Oh, excuse me, let me go back a slide here. About the ARRA and the BTOP program within the ARRA back in 2010. We had a number of research and education networks participate in that program. It doesn't also capture the, excuse me, I'm having trouble here keeping on the same slide. It doesn't capture a number of individual higher education institutions that participated in this program as well. There are a couple of Universal Service Fund programs that our members participate in. Excuse me, having trouble with my staying on the same slide here. The Healthcare Connect Fund, as well as the E-Rate Fund, Healthcare Connect, R&E networks partner with state telehealth networks. And also there's an opportunity within that program to improve connectivity to higher education institutions that have academic healthcare programs. Most recently, the CARES Act, participating in some of the previous last year's federal funding programs. Some of our members use these funds to host CBRS pilots to help solve homework gap issues, to provide large-scale outdoor Wi-Fi installations for public libraries, increase bandwidth to higher education. And lastly, I'll mention that we partner closely with the National Science Foundation in one of their programs to help support grants for campus cyber infrastructure. This is IT infrastructure that directly supports academic research for these institutions. It looks like my slides are having a mind of their own today in terms of moving ahead. Excuse me for that. But I would like to provide a specific example to you today of an incredibly exciting project that is happening right now on the West Coast, which is the biggest middle mile project in the country taking shape in California called Golden State Net. The Research and Education Network in California is called CENIC, which is selected by the California Department of Technology as a third-party administrator for this network. Again, it's a large middle mile network project. CENIC is one of the leading global research and education networks with strong infrastructure partnerships with a number of different types of industry partners being leveraged for this particular project. I'll let you soak in some of the specifics here of that project before moving ahead. And they're just launching now on 18 projects, specifically targeting unserved and underserved areas of the state for tribal communities, counties, and cities. And it's really the first step in connecting these different pieces and different segments of infrastructure out in these underserved areas into a larger statewide middle mile program. So as we think about, the scale and scope of the importance of middle mile networks, I really like to highlight this, this very current example of a large-scale middle mile program leveraging all sorts of partnerships in the state of California for the benefit of that state's citizens. All right, next I'm going to turn to research and education networks as middle mile partners. And, every statewide research and education network across the country is an active testimony of successful deployment of operations of middle mile infrastructure with the purpose of serving our public service missions to continuously improve connectivity for community anchor institutions for their use of the internet and applications. For decades, R&E networks have operated high-capacity, high-performance optical networks in support of our public service missions, and many of these networks own and control their own middle mile and some of their last mile network infrastructure. And this really allows the R&E networks to respond to the unique requirements of community anchor institutions and help sustain those increases of bandwidth utilization needed by these institutions over time. R&E networks serve a very important role in their state landscapes as a trusted, neutral technology expert, able to bring in and bring to the table many different types of partners to help execute on middle mile infrastructure projects. Successful track record of establishing these types of partnerships with a really broad set of different partners throughout the states. And lastly, I'll say from my previous slide of those R&E networks that participated in previous middle mile federally funded programs, this infrastructure is still key today, still key in these different areas in delivering affordable internet access to unserved and underserved areas due to the open access agreements and partnerships that are still developed out of that program from over a decade ago. So I want to emphasize here the long-lasting impact of middle mile infrastructure in terms of what it can do for these unserved and underserved areas. All right, let's see. Sarah touched on this in her overview of the Middle Mile program, so I won't spend too much time on the upcoming slides, but I will want to showcase with you some of the important elements from the R&E networking perspective of the Middle Mile infrastructure. Certainly open access is a key piece of this. This once-in-a-generation funding that will be coming into these different communities across our country. Now that infrastructure is there, we want to make sure that that through the decades coming up, that lots of different entities are able to tap into those federal investments. So important elements, these are terms that Sarah used in her presentation earlier, but non-discriminatory open access, which can take many different types of forms in terms of fiber IRUs, potentially dark wave optical services, and certainly the idea of provider neutral exchange points out into these communities to help really cut down the costs of providing this access to the homes in the unserved and underserved areas. Sarah also touched on the key aspects of a program that will help monitor the adherence to the rules that are put out for open access and interconnect. And part of the comments that the Quilt and Internet 2 submitted recently, also offered the recommendation that these types of requests for open access and interconnect, acceptances and denials be part of a regular reporting for these funded projects. Resiliency is key for Middle Mile, and that's really comes down to the evaluation and performance of that first network design. Are there single points of failure? How rapidly can a fiber cut be recovered? How easily can the network be segmented or augmented? What's the plan for network backup? And certainly demonstration of the resiliency of the network and the strength of that network design with performance metrics. And then long-term, of course, is sustainability. You know, we talk about this, and thank you so much for really trying to explain, give us the concept of how much money will be coming into our different areas of the country. And so that's just for, you know, creating and establishing and constructing some of these. But there are those ongoing expenses. So sustainability is so important. The operating expenses need to be addressed. And certainly funding needs to be available for capital refresh. So we want these investments to live on and to really help propagate broadband for decades to come into these communities. And certainly we want that done with technology that's scalable, that will certainly, if we're talking about once in a generation funding, be funding and technology that helps carry us well into the future. Here are a few other key infrastructure program components. Sarah talked about the broad set of eligible entities, which is very exciting to see. Also, we know that specific geographies that are challenged for broadband access are not limited to state boundaries. And so we think about some of the geographically challenged areas of our country, for instance, the Four Corners area or the northern tier states, where it may make sense for these types of projects to be leveraged in a cost-effective way across state lines and perhaps consider multi-state consortia proposals. And we're also very pleased to see the consideration given to other types of mapping data available out there to help demonstrate unserved and underserved communities. And lastly, as it relates to middle mile infrastructure, I just wanted to leave some thoughts around digital equity in higher education. The National Urban League presented a report last spring called the Lewis Latimer's Plan for Digital Equity and Conclusion. And in one of the areas of the report talked about one of the greatest issues that our country faces when it comes to digital equity is digital equity in higher education. A majority of our country's community colleges, minority-serving institutions, and smaller colleges and universities still lack the type of high-quality connectivity that would allow them to participate and be at the forefront of STEM education and STEM research. So as we think about some of these state plans for digital equity, we certainly encourage the states, when they bring together stakeholders, to have representatives of these different educational institutions at the table, very close to the communities that they serve, and to be able to represent the interests and the priorities and the needs in these communities for interconnectivity and into that middle mile connectivity. So thank you very much. I'll leave it there and turn it back over to Jim.
Jen, excellent review of the quilt. And also, I have to say, I like what you said about once in a generation investment. And that gets back, we talk about the numbers, but that is so significant. And I thought you did a fantastic job. So thank you so much, Jen, for that. Let's do another checkpoint here as far as a polling question. Has your organization applied for any former middle mile grant programs? Yes, but we not received funding. No, I'm not sure. So why don't you start responding, attendees? And as we're looking at the people responding, we will have some time for questions at the end of this webinar. And there was one question that came up: are people going to? We're going to make these slides available. Yes, they will be available after we get done today. So attendees, just a couple more seconds. Please chime in on those 4 categories. And then in a few minutes, we'll go to the next presenter and have a couple panel questions, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end, answer more of your questions. We got quite a few here, actually. So about 3-4 seconds here. I'll have the drum roll, and we've got the responses. So here we are. So the 2 big categories, about 30% no, but the not sure is still hitting that 70%. So it looks like there's a lot of interest moving forward. So thank you so much for answering this polling question. With that, I'd like to introduce Scott Pullman. He's a Director of Business Development, Higher Education Practice at Lumen. So Scott, take us on your next part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Jim. Appreciate it. I want to talk a little bit about sustainability. I think it's really critical. I think both Jen and Sarah touched on that. And it is, one of the beauties of building out your own infrastructure is that you get a large amount of money, you build out that infrastructure, and once it's in place, when you're incrementally adding additional bandwidth to that, it's very inexpensive. So large upfront costs, but less ongoing costs to keep it up. But one of the things I wanted to just highlight today was that there are many different aspects of infrastructure, and everybody usually focuses on the big upfront cost to do the build out, and then forgets about the ongoing costs that are associated with it. So I'm just going to provide a few examples of, I'll show a quick example of what a typical dark fiber infrastructure looks like. I'll discuss the components of it and the costs for those standard components, which are predominantly the upfront costs. Then I want to highlight some other supporting services that you may or may not need to go along with your network. And then to wrap things up, I'll give a couple of examples of alternate types of infrastructure, for example, DWDM waves. So let's hop right in. Oh, one too fast. All right, so this is what a typical dark fiber service looks like. So there's really three components of it. There's the fiber itself. There's the DWDM equipment, which takes the data and encodes it onto that fiber. And then generally with inner city infrastructure, you'll have inline amplifiers. So as that light's moving down the fiber, it gets weaker. So every 40 to 60 miles, you have to regenerate that fiber. Now, depending on how you build out your system, you may have your DWDM equipment in, for example, on your campus or in a local data center. And if that is the case, you may need metro fiber to connect to your carrier's facility, which is labeled as a gateway in this particular diagram. So that's just how the thing's laid out. So you have your DWDM equipment at one end of the network. That's where you're connecting your routers, and then you'll have one at the other end. And that's also where, for example, you may be interconnecting with rural ISPs or other entities that are providing that last broadband service. So let me talk a little bit about the costs associated with these. So in general, the focus is on that upfront cost for the fiber itself. So you generally have an IRU fee that covers a 20-year term for that fiber. And then you'll also have an operations and maintenance fee that's generally paid on an annual basis. And that operation and maintenance covers things. So for example, if that fiber gets cut, the carrier will have a team that will go out to the fiber and things like that, ongoing maintenance. But then there's a bunch of other costs associated with it. So every location in that network where you have a facility, you'll need equipment. So you have to buy the equipment. You have to pay maintenance on the equipment. You have to buy a rack within that facility. You have to have power within that facility. So these are all ongoing, typically monthly recurring charges that you're going to face, and you need to be aware of and budget for those. And then I think Jen mentioned as well, and I have on my slide, is that every 5 to 7 years you're going to have to refresh that equipment because it becomes out of life or out of term, or the next generation of equipment comes out, and you want to make sure that your network's staying up to date. So that's a consideration to keep in mind. And then one other thing that has become more important over the last year or so is CPI. So in general, when you have operations and maintenance and space and power in these facilities, they can be adjusted annually in your contract based on the consumer price index. Well, for the last 5 or 10 years, it's averaged around 1 or 2%, so not that big of a deal. Last year, the consumer price increase was 7.5%. So something to keep in mind. Now, fortunately, most carriers and most customers have clauses in their contract to limit the amount that can rise. It's typically around 3%. It varies obviously by customer and by carrier. But just something to keep in mind is a cost that can sneak up on you because that's accumulating year over year. That's kind of it for the standard cost component. So I'll talk a little bit about some alternative products and alternative costs that may come up. So one of them is installation services. So many universities and entities have a lot of experience and a lot of staff that are familiar with the routing and switching infrastructure that's available on campuses, but maybe not as much on the dark fiber side of the house and installing DWDM gear. So you can hire your carrier or other companies to do that deployment for you and install that equipment, provide field tech services. So some of these inline amplifier huts may be way out in rural areas, and so you'll need somebody to jump in a car and drive out there and replace a part when need be. And then also a lot of the carriers offer ongoing network monitoring and management. A couple of other additional charges that tend to sneak up on people, though, are things like taxes and fees and surcharges, property tax surcharges, things like that. So relocation charges. So if your fiber infrastructure is along a highway right-of-way and the state decides to build a new intersection there, they're going to have to move that fiber. Well, what a lot of folks don't realize is that everybody that has a pair of fibers on that infrastructure or on that fiber are assessed a portion of that cost to do that fiber relocation. So again, if you want to have a sustainable network long term, these are just some of the things you have to keep in mind, that there are a lot of different components to be aware of, and always work with, with your carrier, with your equipment provider, and also reach out to organizations like the Quilt that have members that have done a lot of these in the past that can provide you a lot of best practices and give you a lot of advice on what to do and what to look out for when making sure that your network can sustain over time. A couple other things I want to touch on briefly, and these are just sort of options to buying a whole dark fiber infrastructure. The first one is just a managed optical fiber network. So in this case, instead of your entity or your institution buying the equipment, engineering it, doing all the work on it, you can hire the carrier or a third party, for example, your equipment provider, to build all that infrastructure out for you, do the engineering, install it, and run it for you. So this is sort of a hybrid between owning the equipment and doing everything yourself and buying a carrier service. So it gives you a little bit more flexibility than just buying a carrier service, but takes some of the complexity out by pushing that complexity off onto your vendor. And then the final one I'll talk about is OTN waves. This is a relatively new alternative. So all carriers offer wavelength services, but recently there's been a lot of work at standardizing those services. And so there's a capability now called an OTN wave. So an OTN wave is a standards-based wave. So since it's standard-based, you could have an OTN wave with one vendor's equipment providing the service, usually through a carrier, and then you can provide your own equipment on the edge of that network. And your own equipment doesn't have to be the same vendor as the carriers. It could be any vendor that you choose. And this allows you to mux and demux traffic onto that backbone using your own equipment on site. So this gives you much more flexibility than you would get by just buying a wave service from a carrier, and a lot less complexity than buying and building out this entire infrastructure on your own. So hopefully that was good information. I was just being brief there, so leave some time for questions, and I will turn it back over to Jim.
Hey, great technical information, a wealth of information. I was taking notes myself, so thank you very much, Scott, for that. Let's. We have another polling question for the audience, real quick. How experienced is your organization working with the technologies associated with infrastructure builds, as is dark fiber, DWDM, or waves? So the categories, if you can chime in real quick. You consider yourself inexperienced, but will be engaging vendors. Somewhat experienced or very experienced. So attendees, can you just chime in real quickly about where you are so we get a sense, some feedback for the attendees as well as the panelists about where you're at on this. So I appreciate it. We'll just give this a few seconds so everybody can chime in. And again, these slides will be available, and we'll have a chance in the remaining 10 or so minutes for some questions that have come in. So we'll get to those in just a few seconds here. So another 5 seconds for you to add your input here, and we'll see what we come up with. So we'll say 3, 2 with the countdown, 1, and the results are in, and this is what we got. So we got about 22% inexperienced, so the majority, 50%, somewhat experienced and very experienced. So it's kind of off the board, but I think there's some room for some additional information, I think, for the group, that they can do a good presentation and a good application. So with that in mind, I thought we could ask a few questions to our panelists of Scott, Jen, and Sarah. I'm going to just kind of a broad question. One that's come in is that if there are 3 pieces of advice you would give an organization submitting an application, I'm going to throw this to Sarah. And Sarah, if I could add, when you look at the infrastructure plan, is it much different than previous? And maybe those 2 questions. So what's your 3 pieces of advice, and do you see this much different than other than the dollars allocated, Sarah?
Thank you, Jim. I'd like to begin addressing Paula Reek's question about we have not opened up the window to apply for middle mile, just so you know. We will be, for the middle mile program, posting the notice of funding opportunity in May, and then you'll have a window to apply. How is this different? My experience is limited to the last year working on the federal grant side. And so what I've been most familiar with is the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Middle mile is, we allowed middle mile with the Broadband Infrastructure Program. What we really want to do at the end of the day is connect unserved and underserved households. And so it's similar in that regard. I'll also say that it's difficult when you're bidding on middle mile grants to really align with the last mile providers to show that who are you going to connect to? What's the status of those business relationships? How many households are you going to be able to serve? So my biggest piece of advice, we are in a phase right now that we call pre-NOFO. And we have what we call technical assistance. And that means, like, for example, today we have a listening session. And if you go to our website, if you Google Broadband USA and NTIA, you'll find our website and go to the events. And there you'll find all of our listening sessions, as well as webinars that we will be hosting before the NOFO. And then additionally, after the NOFO, to talk about how to apply, which forms you need, what we're looking for, answering all kinds of questions. So my biggest piece of advice is really, once the NOFO is published, know it, understand it, attend our webinars, reach out to us for technical assistance, reach out to me. My email is my S and last name, BLEAU @ntia.gov, because I have that experience in the private sector for so many years. The real reason that I was hired was to be the industry liaison. And so I consider this audience as part of industry. And we want to hear, how can we make your life easier in applying for these programs? So that's not super helpful maybe, but please visit our website, send me emails, listen to our webinars. That's what I would do.
Excellent. I'm going to ask Jen a question. I have to go back when we talked about the quilt. I really do enjoy your slide of the United States with all the intersecting lines. And my question is, when you look at those lines, are there areas that you'd like to see more involvement in, and how can you help those places where you haven't connected? I think you mentioned Idaho, or a new organization to join the quilt. When you look at that map, where would you like to see more growth and assistance?
Well, I think that there are some common places that align, just with the quilt map. But if you overlying any type of general broadband infrastructure, there are areas of our country that continue to be challenged for connectivity. I mentioned a few in terms of the Four Corners area, some of the northern tier areas. If there are places in our country, some states where there may not be a statewide research and education network, but certainly there are leading universities in these states that would be excellent resources in terms of partnership and best practices and expertise in participating and in understanding some of the broadband infrastructure. So where you see some of those maybe some areas in that map where there aren't lines going through. These are certainly areas that are likely still unserved and underserved, as well as maybe also needing an organizing body where leading universities in those areas can be excellent partners in those aspects.
Excellent, thank you. And this is for each of you. And Scott, please chime in if you will as well. When you look at a successful project, there's some other additional examples about what really makes a project stand out, because it's a competitive process, obviously. But what are those things that you've either seen, you've worked with, or an application you've come across in previous years that this really sets itself apart? Can one of you talk about that briefly?
Yeah, Jim, if you don't mind, I'll jump in.
Yeah,
I want to add one thing to what Jen was saying as well. One thing that I found kind of striking, because we've been working a lot with the folks in California, and generally when you think about unserved and unserved area, you look at the map and you think of, Wyoming, the Dakotas or whatever. If you look at LA County, which is, I believe the most populous county in the entire United States, there are huge portions of LA County that are unserved or underserved. So, adding more lines to the map will be helpful, but it's also in urban areas where there's a lot of underserved areas. And then to your point about what has been successful in the past, I think organizations that have been very collaborative, not only with the communities that they're trying to serve, with their vendor community, with carriers, because it really, getting letters of support from a broad constituency really helps applications, I think, going forward. And I think Jen probably can talk more to this than I can, but I think most of the folks that were successful because they had a very broad range of entities that were involved in their application for funding.
Jen, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I will. And
sure.
Thank you, staff, for mentioning the fact that it's, unserved and underserved areas are not just rural areas, that there are many metro parts of metro areas that are still considered underserved. So thank you for making that point. And I want to echo what Scott said in terms of what makes for good applications. Collaboration is key. You want entities leading and participating in these proposals that have that collaborative spirit, that have that community-minded spirit, that are folks that really understand that landscape, really understand the community stakeholders. And that goes to the sustainability of these projects as well. When you've got that community involvement and a broad set of stakeholders involved, it's just a more impactful and I would venture to say, likelihood for longer term success with larger stakeholders involved, especially collaborative ones. Yep.
Right. What kind of a message could you give administrators? We talk about collaboration, and I like kind of the key word I like to talk about is advocacy. Who is that one person who's going to help drive the finish line? What kind of message can you give to higher ed or other organizations? Who is that advocacy person at the institution?
Jim, is that question for me?
Any of you? My three experts. Yes. What have you seen, Jen?
Well, these proposals, yes, there are a tremendous amount of dollars but these are tremendous projects, and it takes a good deal of effort and a very strong team to carry them over the finish line. From your technologists to your communications to your convening partners, there are so many aspects of this. So it's not just on technology, but there's a lot of coordination that goes in a quick amount of time, right? The deadlines are usually tend to be very tight. I'll look to Sarah for this. And so, this is work that these are conversations that you want to already be having with stakeholders in your areas and talking about ideas. Mapping data is so key for this. But there always is, a leading body, and that really needs to be a trusted, neutral, collaborative party that's helping to bring all those other partners to the table for a successful proposal.
Excellent. There's a question that just came up. If we could, in about a minute or so, the question is for higher education institutions. This person is struggling of how to leverage the program. It seems that unless a higher education institution intends to provide broadband service to the community, then would it not make sense to apply? Is that accurate?
I can jump in, and then Sarah, I know you're getting ready to talk too, but I think that's inaccurate. So it's really about providing that middle mile infrastructure, right? So, I work for a carrier, and there are areas, for example, in Northern California, where I can honestly say that AT&T, Verizon, Lumen, we're never going to build there because there's just not enough. There's not a business case for it. And that's what this funding is, the gap that it's trying to fill. So you build out that middle mile, and then you encourage development of broadband, providers in those areas. So Sarah, please.
Yeah, I would echo that. And a lot of what Jen and Scott have both talked about with collaboration, that $1 billion sounds like a lot, and you can spend it in 2,700 years if you spend $1,000 a day, but it goes fast. And so I would recommend reach out, look around you. Who are other institutions in the same boat? Can you work together, collaborate? Is there an ISP? Is there a construction company who might want to work with you? I would definitely. I don't think that you're prohibited from applying, but I would definitely talk to other universities and hospitals and municipalities in your neck of the woods, and look at the carriers also who are available.
Excellent. Well, with that, we have more questions, but we're running out of time. When I just one person just said, awesome call. Can we have more calls like this? This is an excellent presentation. So that's a great way of ending it today. I do want to be respectful of our time today. So I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank you for being respectful of our our commitment. So we'll wrap it up now. In closing, I want to thank everybody on the panel, and also a big thank you to our sponsor, Lumen, for this. Scott, Jen, and Sarah did a fantastic job. And again, I hope you enjoyed this. We appreciate your involvement, and be safe and be well. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks.